Ukraine just sent a message to the Kremlin that few believed was still possible. A message not delivered through speeches, diplomacy, or sanctions, but through the roar of jet engines and the unmistakable silhouette of MiG-29 fighter aircraft slicing through contested skies. For months, analysts claimed Ukraine's Soviet-era Air Force was slowly fading, outmatched by Russia's size, technology, and resources. Yet suddenly, 10 MiG-29 fighters appeared where Moscow least expected them: active, armed, coordinated, and deadly. This was not just a military maneuver, it was psychological warfare at its finest. To understand why these 10 aircraft matter so much, you have to understand what the MiG-29 represents. Designed during the Cold War to counter American F-15s and F-16s, the MiG-29 was built for speed, agility, and raw combat power. It was never meant to be subtle. Even decades later, its presence carries symbolic weight across Eastern Europe and especially inside Russia. This is a jet that Russian pilots know intimately. Seeing it flown effectively by Ukrainian forces is like facing your own reflection in battle and losing to it. Since the early days of the war, Russia has repeatedly claimed air superiority over Ukraine. State media confidently announced that Ukraine's Air Force had been destroyed within the first weeks. Air bases bombed, runways cratered, aircraft eliminated on the ground, but reality on the battlefield told a different story. Ukrainian pilots adapted, dispersed their aircraft, operated from improvised runways, and learned to survive under constant missile threat. Every sortie became a gamble with death, yet they kept flying. What shocked the Kremlin was not just that Ukraine still had MiG-29s, but that it could suddenly deploy 10 of them in a coordinated operational role. 10 fighters in modern air warfare is not a massive fleet, but under these circumstances, it was a statement. It meant Ukraine had preserved pilots, maintenance crews, spare parts, command and control systems, and the ability to plan complex air operations under fire. That alone shattered Moscow's narrative. These MiG-29s were not frozen in time. They were upgraded. Quietly, steadily, with Western assistance and Ukrainian ingenuity, the aircraft were modified to use NATO, standard weapons, advanced avionics, and improved radar capabilities. This turned an aging Soviet platform into a hybrid fighter, capable of delivering modern missiles with surprising accuracy. Russia did not expect that. They assumed Ukraine's jets were obsolete relics. Instead, they became something far more dangerous, unpredictable. When these 10 fighters entered contested airspace, Russian radar operators noticed immediately. MiG-29 signatures lit up screens that were supposed to be quiet. Alerts were triggered. Air defense units went on high readiness. Fighter squadrons were scrambled. For Russian commanders, this was a nightmare scenario, not because of the number of jets, but because of what they implied. Ukraine was not just surviving, Ukraine was planning. The appearance of these aircraft forced Russia to react, and reaction is expensive. Every time Russian air defenses activate, they burn resources. Every interceptor launched costs millions. Every fighter scrambled consumes fuel, maintenance hours, and pilot fatigue. Ukraine understands this asymmetry well. Even limited air operations can drain a larger force if executed strategically. The Kremlin also faced a deeper problem. These MiG-29s were not just flying defensively, they were hunting. Ukrainian pilots used terrain masking, low-altitude approaches, and coordinated drone intelligence to identify targets. Russian logistics hubs, ammunition depots, and troop concentrations, suddenly found themselves under threat from above. For ground forces that had grown accustomed to relative air safety, this was a rude awakening. Morale matters in war, and the psychological impact of these flights cannot be overstated. Russian soldiers on the front lines heard Ukrainian jets overhead, jets they had been told no longer existed. Ukrainian troops, meanwhile, saw proof that their air force was alive and fighting. In war, belief can be as powerful as firepower. Internationally, the message was just as loud. Allies watching from Europe and North America saw confirmation that Ukraine could effectively use advanced aircraft systems. This strengthened arguments for providing even more capable jets in the future. If Ukraine could make MiG-29s work under these conditions, what could it do with modern Western fighters? The 10 MiGs became a flying argument for continued military support. Inside Russia, the reaction was far more uncomfortable. Kremlin officials avoided discussing the incident directly, while state media downplayed its significance. But military bloggers and analysts, many with ties to Russian forces, openly expressed concern. They questioned how Ukraine was sustaining its air operations. They criticized command failures. They asked uncomfortable questions about readiness, intelligence gaps, and overconfidence. The MiG-29 has also exposed a critical vulnerability in Russia's air defense strategy. While Russia possesses one of the most extensive surfaced missile networks in the world, these systems are designed primarily to counter high-altitude threats. Low, flying fast, moving fighters using unpredictable flight paths are much harder to detect and engage. Ukraine exploited this weakness repeatedly. Every successful Ukrainian sortie forced Russian planners to rethink their assumptions. Air superiority is not a switch that can be flipped once and forgotten. It must be constantly maintained. And suddenly, Russia was being reminded of that truth by an opponent it believed was already neutralized. There is also a symbolic layer to this moment that goes beyond tactics and technology. The MiG-29 is a product of Soviet engineering, a shared military heritage between Russia and Ukraine. Seeing it used against Russian forces is deeply unsettling for the Kremlin. It challenges the narrative that Ukraine is merely a former territory needing to be reclaimed. Instead, it shows Ukraine as an equal inheritor of that legacy, capable, independent, and defiant. These 10 fighters did not change the war overnight. They did not grant Ukraine total control of the skies, but wars are rarely decided by single actions. They are shaped by momentum, perception, and pressure. And in that sense, the MiG-29 deployment was a strategic success. It forced Russia to divert attention, adjust plans, and acknowledge that Ukraine's Air Force remains a threat. For Ukrainian pilots, the mission carried enormous risk. Russian airspace is saturated with missiles, radar, and interceptors. Every flight could be their last, yet they flew anyway, knowing the impact their presence alone could have. This level of commitment reflects a broader truth about the conflict. Ukraine is not fighting for leverage at the negotiating table. It is fighting for survival. As the war continues, the skies over Ukraine remain contested, dangerous, and unpredictable. But one thing is now clear. The assumption that Ukraine's air power is finished is no longer credible. 10 MiG-29 fighters were enough to remind the Kremlin and the world that this war is far from over and that Ukraine still has cards left to play. In modern warfare, victory is not always about overwhelming force. Sometimes it's about timing, surprise, and the courage to act when your enemy least expects it. Ukraine's decision to deploy these MiG-29s was exactly that, a calculated risk, a bold signal, and a reminder that underestimating a determined opponent can be one of the most costly mistakes a power like Russia can make. The message sent to the Kremlin was unmistakable. Ukraine is still flying. Ukraine is still fighting. And Ukraine is not done yet.